Olá, boa tarde a todos. Sejam bem-vindos à primeira Semana Internacional FEI. Eu sou Diane da Silveira, da Coordenadoria de Relações Internacionais, e vou estar com vocês durante esta semana apresentando os nossos convidados. Antes de iniciarmos a palestra de hoje, convido a professora doutora Michele de Souza, vice-reitora de Extensão e Atividades Comunitárias, para a abertura oficial do evento.
Prezados alunos e convidados, é com grande entusiasmo que eu dou a todos vocês as boas-vindas a essa primeira Semana Internacional da FEI, agradecendo a Diane, coordenadora do setor de Relações Internacionais, e ao setor de Comunicação e Marketing pela organização do evento. Esse evento será dedicado à discussão sobre a internacionalização em nossa instituição. Em um mundo cada vez mais interconectado e globalizado, a internacionalização não é apenas uma opção, mas sim uma necessidade para garantir a relevância e a excelência da FEI. A internacionalização vai muito além de atrair estudantes estrangeiros ou estabelecer parcerias com universidades em outros países. Ela engloba uma ampla gama de iniciativas que visam promover a diversidade, a inovação e a excelência acadêmica em todos os aspectos da nossa universidade. Em primeiro lugar, a internacionalização traz uma riqueza incomparável para o ambiente de aprendizado. Ao receber estudantes estrangeiros e enviar nossos estudantes a diferentes países, enriquecemos os debates, promovemos a troca de conhecimentos e experiências e ampliamos os horizontes dos nossos alunos. A diversidade cultural e o intercâmbio de ideias são fundamentais para formarmos cidadãos globais preparados para os desafios do século XXI. Além disso, a internacionalização é essencial para impulsionar a pesquisa e a inovação. Ao colaborarmos com instituições de renome internacional, ampliamos o acesso a recursos, expertise e infraestrutura de ponta, possibilitando a realização de estudos de alto impacto e relevância global. A colaboração transnacional não só enriquece as nossas pesquisas, mas também nos coloca na vanguarda do conhecimento em diversas áreas do saber. Outro aspecto relevante da internacionalização é a preparação dos nossos alunos para um mercado de trabalho cada vez mais globalizado. Ao oferecer programas de intercâmbio, estágios internacionais e oportunidades de aprendizado, estamos equipando os nossos estudantes com habilidades e competências que são necessárias para se destacarem em um ambiente de trabalho cada vez mais diversificado e competitivo. A experiência internacional não só enriquece o currículo dos nossos alunos, mas também aumenta a sua empregabilidade e competitividade no mercado de trabalho. Por fim, a internacionalização contribui também para o prestígio e a reputação da nossa universidade, tanto em nível nacional quanto internacional. Ao cultivarmos uma comunidade acadêmica globalmente reconhecida pela excelência e pela inovação, atraímos talentos, recursos e oportunidades que elevam o nosso padrão de qualidade e impacto. No entanto, devemos estar cientes também dos desafios que acompanham a internacionalização. Dentre eles, cito desde questões relacionadas à diversidade cultural até barreiras linguísticas, que exigem nossa atenção e dedicação. No entanto, é importante lembrar que esses desafios não são insuperáveis. Com determinação, colaboração e uma visão compartilhada, podemos superar essas barreiras e construir uma comunidade acadêmica verdadeiramente global e inclusiva. Em resumo, a internacionalização é um compromisso com a excelência, a inovação e a inclusão que ajudará a moldar o futuro da FEI e preparará os nossos alunos para os desafios e oportunidades de um mundo em constante transformação. Portanto, convido a todos a se engajarem ativamente nesse processo e a contribuírem para tornar a nossa universidade, a FEI, uma referência global de ensino, pesquisa e inovação. Ao longo desta primeira Semana Internacional da FEI, serão realizadas palestras sobre a importância da internacionalização, estágio no exterior, modalidades e oportunidades de intercâmbio oferecidas pela FEI, tanto na graduação como na pós-graduação. Será realizada também uma roda de conversa, onde egressos da FEI, hoje trabalhando no exterior, falarão sobre suas carreiras internacionais. Com isso, declaro aberto esse evento e desejo a todos uma discussão bastante produtiva e enriquecedora sobre a importância da internacionalização e as oportunidades oferecidas pela FEI. Obrigada.
Obrigada, professora Michele. Now I would like to introduce you our guest speaker, who is going to talk to us about the intercultural competences, Dr. Diane Ceo-DiFrancesco. She's a professor of Spanish and Education at Xavier University in the United States. Dr. Diane delivers webinars and training workshops internationally on COIL methodology, virtual exchange, intercultural competence, and service learning. After this quick introduction, Dr. Diane, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here and to share with you a little bit about our topic today, international competence for global leadership. I'm going to start by sharing the slideshow. Here we go. There we go. So for this International Education Week. So what are our objectives of this session? First, we're going to examine a little bit about terminology. What do we mean by culture? What is intercultural competence? And why does all that matter anyhow, right? And we will examine applications of the intercultural competency model, and then talk about some next steps, some strategies for your own context, whether you're a student, a professor, a former student, a professional out in the community. What are some strategies for you in developing intercultural competency, advocacy, and then as you head toward developing global leadership in your community? So first, we're going to start with the topic of culture. And I grabbed these images of culture thinking, okay, which one would you like to be able to use to represent the concept of culture? There are 4 here. If we were in a workshop in person, I would ask people to share. Maybe do you pick the onion and why? Or the iceberg, and why does that represent culture for you? Or the glasses, or the fish swimming. So think about it for a moment, and then as we move on. But why would the image that you choose make the most sense in representing the concept of culture as we begin to talk about it? So, and also as we think about representing culture, we can think of a representation that's more of a multi-sensorial approach to culture, right? There are many sights, sounds, smells, and experiences. This particular photo collage is from a COIL interaction that my students had with students in Lima, Peru. And we asked them to share images of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So we want to be able to show the best of our country also, but what are some of maybe the global issues and challenges that we face locally and globally? So let's do another sort of visualization for a minute. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to close your eyes, if it's easier for you to try to visualize, what do you think of? What comes to your brain first when I say the activity of fishing, right? Going fishing. What does that look like for you? And I'll give you just a moment to kind of get that picture in your brain. If we were together, I would ask you to share out a few of those. Some people in the past, when I share this activity, will talk about, well, I remember going fishing with my dad when I was younger, and we would take a picnic basket, we would take a little boat, and we would take a fishing pole. And so that may have been the image. Or some people that maybe growing up lived by a lake, or going down to the river with your fishing pole, catching a fish and then taking it back to cook. So I went online and I found an interesting image that I thought I would share with you. And so here it is. I wonder if this image was what came to your mind about fishing. And maybe not. This the fishing pole is very different. The landscape might be different for you. And this is one perspective, right? But when we think about how we visualize things, it helps us to understand that these different perspectives based on our own context and our own culture. So I could ask you, how do you visualize greetings? So, during the pandemic, maybe your greetings looked like that, right? And hopefully, culturally, it didn't change the way we greet each other forever. Maybe now you feel comfortable having more physical contact, if that is how you typically have greeted someone in your culture, with a kiss on a cheek or on both cheeks, or a little hug, right? And then how do you see nature? What do you visualize with nature? Is nature something that we need to control, or something that just flows around us? And we could ask this question also about things like, I have asked students to visualize, what does bread look like for you? One summer I taught at another university summer program in northern Spain, and my husband liked to take our children to the local bakery while I was teaching. And there were visuals of many, many, many different types of breads. And when we think about it, we think it could be flatbread, it could be a Mexican tortilla, or a French baguette, or there's so many different images of bread that we can share. So visualizing maybe even a cup of coffee. What does your coffee look like? Is it a takeout paper cup? Is it a little Demitasse cup? Is it coffee with milk, café con leche? What does your coffee look like? So this kind of visual exercise helps us to get a little bit of a better sense of how we represent culture. And another way we can do that visually is through the cultural iceberg. This analogy of culture as an iceberg was first introduced to us by Edward T. Hall, an anthropologist, in 1976. Hall wanted to help people understand how people come to develop cultural awareness. And using this model, or this visual of the iceberg, we know that only about 1/9, at this point, maybe more, 1/9 of the iceberg is visual above water, and thus the bulk of the iceberg is hidden upon first glance. And so Hall is suggesting to us that, like an iceberg, only a small fraction of culture is visible to individuals when they first encounter a new way of life. The deeper levels of culture, characterized by things like attitudes and core values, maybe even various perspectives, they're not immediately observable to us. They tend to be that part of the iceberg that's hidden below the water's surface. And yet they underlie all of the visual behaviors that we find and that we observe on the surface, right? And another question that I like to add to this model is another segment of that iceberg where we can say, what do we all have in common as humans, right? We all want to love, we all want to be loved. There are some basic aspects of being human that we share, and I'd like to include that with this model as well. So if we ask the question then, what do we mean by culture? It's interesting. Culture can be a very ambiguous, it could be a confusing term. I know that the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in English offers a number of definitions, and in 2014, so over 10 years ago now, it was the word of the year, the most searched online, right? One definition developed by Janet Bennett in 2008, she shared that culture represents the values, beliefs, and perspectives learned through interaction with a specific group of people. And then I added that these those values, beliefs, and perspectives also impact the practices and product of a specific group of people. Then what is a cultural generalization? That could be the tendency of a specific group of people to possess these certain values, beliefs, and patterns of behavior. So what is a stereotype? Bennett would tell us that it's the application of that generalization to all of the people of a specific group or culture. Not something that I recommend that we want to do, but I think we do need to be aware of perhaps when we are applying a generalization and a stereotype. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about intercultural competence. There is a definition from UNESCO. UNESCO's done a lot of work and many publications that I would recommend that you explore on the topic of intercultural competence and interculturality. I wanted to share their definition of interculturality, which refers to this egalitarian exchange of communication and relationships among groups that differ according to criteria such as ethnicity, religion, language, or nationality, among others. And so time to reflect for a minute. Let's think about successful interactions that we may have had while interacting with individuals from a variety of cultural backgrounds. What were the elements, if I could give you just a moment to reflect, what were some of the elements that were necessary for those interactions to be successful? Think about that for just a moment as we move along. And on the left, you do see, I do a lot of work with virtual mobility and internationalization. So I will make reference and you will see you'll see a number of images of my students interacting virtually. So we could ask ourselves, so what are the competencies that the intercultural competencies, and why are they important in our increasingly globalized society? Why do we need to be talking about those competencies? What are they? We do have a definition by Spitzberg and Chango here from 2009, referencing the effect of an appropriate interaction between people who represent distinct perspectives and orientations of the world. There are various definitions and references to intercultural, to working across culture, right? Can be defined as a set of behaviors and attitudes that equip one to work effectively in cross-cultural contexts, and that's from Cross et al., 1989. In fields related to healthcare, intercultural competency is sometimes referred to as the ability to provide care to diverse populations in order to meet patients' diverse needs. And it's sometimes referred to as cultural humility. That definition is by Betancourt et al., 2002. And also we know that it is a process involving self-evaluation and empathy in order to foster relationships with clients of diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and beliefs. And that's from Yeager and Bauer Wu, 2013. So those are just a few of the various definitions that exist regarding intercultural competency, intercultural or cultural humility. In fact, the term can be a little bit misleading given that the development of intercultural competency is a process, and it is a lifelong process that begins with our own self-awareness of our own cultural positionality. So let's move along to looking at one model and one framework that I think works really well for us. So I'm going to focus a good bit on Darla Deerdorf's work. So frankly, there are probably over 50 terms related to intercultural competency and approximately 142 assessment tools that that have been published or that exist in the research. Fantini, for instance, from 2020, argues that we could use the term intercultural communicative competence, that could be most comprehensive because it does emphasize the inextricable connections of culture and communication. So that's speaking and interacting. There has to be we have to share some language to be able to interact, right? And so that's that place that focuses on language as indispensable and fundamental. And then Fantini and Timerzini in 2006 define intercultural communicative competence as a complex set of skills and abilities needed to interact effectively and appropriately with others who are linguistically and culturally different. However, I would like to share today Darla Deerdorf's work. She used a grounded research-based approach called the Delphi method, in which she took a large number of these models and definitions of intercultural competency to come up with a way to summarize and develop a framework that we could use to represent this lifelong process of developing the skills, attitudes, and behaviors that are necessary to interact appropriately and effectively in intercultural contexts. And that's from her work in 2006 and 2011, and she continues. This is a model of her process orientation, her framework, and you can see that she does involve the attitudes, knowledge, the skills, and then internal outcomes and external outcomes. And I've created a chart also to show us, maybe in a little bit of an easier format to read, some of these categories of intercultural competency that are important. And I want to just name them because as we move forward, you're going to see some of this terminology come up again. So under attitudes, aspects like respect, flexibility, curiosity, openness, tolerance to ambiguity, and acting without judgment. Knowledge really does include, starting with the first step would be our own cultural self-awareness, but then understanding others' worldview and others' perspectives. The skills, what are some of the skills involved? It is starting with a lot of observation, listening. So the listening skill, I would also add active listening to that, as well as analyzing and relating. And then internal outcomes of flexibility, adaptability, empathy, and seeing the world through a new lens. And some of the external results or outcomes would be just that effective and appropriate communication and behavior. So I also discovered in a Deerdorf publication that she has developed some reflection questions that are really great. So you will have these in a recording, and then I can also share this document, or you can find it in Deerdorf's publication from 2011. Some actual questions that you can use as self-reflection. For instance, as far as attitudes, how truly open am I to those from different cultural and socioeconomic, gender, racial, and religious backgrounds? Do I make quick assumptions? Do I prejudge? Do I value those from different backgrounds? And then do I make an effort to show curiosity, to show interest in learning more about others? And then what is my cultural knowledge? What are my values? And how do I describe my worldview? So really getting in touch with some of your own awareness and your own cultural backgrounds and worldviews. And then that practice of that active listening, active observation, and then really taking an interest in that interaction and that intercultural lens. And then just a general reflection, what can I do differently in the future, right? Which is part of critical reflection. So these reflection questions are really essential. And then we could say to ourselves, so why is this important? Why do we need to examine this topic today. And I can share with you that there has been this research. This is just an example of one research project by Alan Parkinson at Brigham Young University. And Alan did a research survey with 14 administrators and others who work in the area of internationalizations at academic institutions at the university level, also with 15 professionals in the private sector and 2 representatives of the government, and this was in the US. His results, what he did notice this great importance in the area of intercultural competence, and this is he related it to the field of engineering. What is significant to the study is that the researcher identified 5 most important attitudes of global competence that are important for engineering graduates. So are you ready? The first one is that they can appreciate other cultures. The second is that they're proficient working in or directing a team of ethnic and cultural diversity. Number 3, they're able to communicate across cultures. And the 4th, they have a chance to practice engineering in a global context. So whether that be through an international internship, a service learning opportunity, a virtual project, or some other type of experiential learning. And the last one, they can effectively deal with ethical issues arising from cultural or national differences. So you see, just from this one research project, we can see that intercultural competency is very important to at least this one field that we're talking about. But I would argue that we can cross fields and it would be important. And if we talk about this in innovation, in internationalization, and just innovation in education in general, I'll share with you a quote by one of my heroes, my pedagogical heroes, Bell Hooks. In her book published in 1994, she does talk about creating spaces for faculty to move beyond these traditional forms of teaching and offering freedom to experiment in new spaces and new realities of learning that permits us to move beyond these traditional contexts and boundaries, okay? So I would say this relates to both teaching and learning, and even if you're already out in the field as a professional. I think just realizing that we need to permit ourselves this freedom to experiment and just move beyond traditional contexts and boundaries. It's so important. So what about the importance of interaction? So I did mention to you that a lot of my work is engaging students through virtual internationalization, through something that we call virtual exchange. And this could be an exchange that is an encounter that's a language exchange, or it could be even more in depth, that it would be a learning module that's shared between 2 or 3 courses and groups of students and professors. And it's something that we call COIL because they're collaborating, they're working on projects, they're interacting during several weeks of their course of study. So it's this connection with others, and I think that offers us this opportunity to incorporate global learning, social justice issues, and intercultural communication into our work and our development as students and professionals. So it's extremely important. What do these encounters with others, what have I learned? What do I share with my students for how to cultivate successful encounters? And my students are spending many times an entire semester working, encountering others, talking about really important global issues that are facing our world today, like violence and racism and poverty and climate change. So here's a list of some of the skills and attitudes that we just saw earlier in the Darla Deerdorf model. framework that my students are applying every time they're interacting with others. So the first is self-awareness. So also being prepared. I can't really talk about healthcare in the US if I don't do a little bit of investigation, right? So being aware of my own culture, my own values, doing some research so that I'm informed and able to share the perspective of my own country, my own culture, and my own values, right? And then being curious about others. Being tolerant of ambiguity and being flexible during my encounter. Something we have found to be really important is to withhold judgment, to place those stereotypes aside and practice curiosity and interest to learn more about others. Practicing active listening, keeping an open mind, and then above all, really after the encounter, some critical reflection is really important as well. I do share, and my students have found, I have a little bit more training that I do with students, but I think we can take these communication norms and we can apply them to different contexts, right? It doesn't just have to be a virtual encounter. It could be you interacting with some diverse students in a class project that you have, or if you're out in the workforce and you have a project that you're working on with a variety of colleagues, right? It's about making eye contact. If it is a virtual encounter, your camera needs to be on because we want to be able to see each other. And then practicing active listening, focusing on what your peers are saying rather than thinking about, oh, what am I going to say next, right? So focusing on every word that your colleague is saying first. And then being open to the perspectives of your colleagues and open to sharing your own. Removing those distractions so you're not checking your phone or so there aren't messages flying in on your computer at all times while you're trying to have this meeting or this encounter. Another thing we've learned is demonstrating interest is really important. And how do we do that? Typically by asking questions, asking follow-up questions to really understand the other person's cultural reality and perspective. And that helps to enrich the conversation, but those questions really help just to demonstrate that you're interested in learning more. And we also found that at the end of the interaction, it's really great to express gratitude for your peer and for the encounter. Now, I mentioned about the role of critical reflection. What is critical reflection? It's really this process of analyzing, reconsidering, questioning your own experiences, your perspectives, your values in that broader context of what you've learned and what you've heard, the perspective and the cultural reality of someone else. And that comes to us from Jacoby in 2015. Brookfield has also done a lot of writing on critical reflection and its role in teaching and learning. And it means regularly asking yourself questions about your actions to better understand why things happen in a certain way, and maybe to inform your actions in the future. John Mesereau has done a lot of work on transformational learning, and an area of transformational learning that's critical is this reflection process. So we're reconsidering our habitual way of how we interpret things, right? And especially that transformative learning happens as we're having this encounter and we're learning the perspectives of others. And we might start to reconsider, oh, well, I never really thought of it that way. So it helps us to call into question some of those previously unquestioned perspectives and maybe to see the world through a new lens. So I believe, however, that without critical reflections, sometimes stereotypes can be reinforced. So if you are a professor, your work with your students on critical reflection is really important. Sometimes we can form inaccurate generalizations or simplistic conclusions. or we can come up with some kind of simplistic solution to some very challenging issue. I'm going to show you a couple of strategies that you can incorporate in either your teaching or your learning on intercultural competency. And one is really starting to develop your own self-awareness. This is an exercise that you can find online. It was compiled by Natalia Diab, and she worked on this document. You'll find it online. It's called Mapping Your Cultural Orientation. It's a really great way for you to get in touch with, where are you along a continuum? It's a great conversational, interactive piece as well as you're interacting with others who have also completed this cultural orientation. And then what's kind of fun is to imagine, okay, what might be my more challenging areas when I'm interacting or, working with others. And then another way that we can just call into question some of our stereotypes and maybe our pre-existing assumptions. Well, there are a couple of TED Talks I'd like to share with you. If you're not familiar with the danger of a single story, I highly recommend this TED Talk for just hearing about the overlapping stories of this authentic cultural experience, and perhaps how stereotypes are formed and how they can be challenged. And then as well, the idea that we can re-examine our perspectives, and what does that mean? And here is a young student who decided, Zachary Wood, who decided, it's really important to talk to somebody who doesn't hold your perspective. How can we then build empathy and understanding and really just apply that active listening to that encounter, right? So you might want to listen to Zachary, and you might learn some strategies from him that you can apply to your next interaction with people who have diverse perspectives. As well, I've created this just simple framework. I didn't fill in the various categories of Darla Deerdorf's framework. For my students, I will ask them at the beginning of the semester or before an immersion experience, whether it be virtual or in person, to set some goals for themselves. And then also to what is their plan of action? And then we can go back and revisit this document midway through the experience to see how are we doing with applying our active listening, or how are we doing with just withholding judgment a bit. So this might be another exercise that would be helpful to you. And then I also really do want to remind everyone that the developing intercultural competence sounds like, I hit it and then I'm there and I'm done, right? But for the purpose of everyone to understand that this is a developmental process, it's a developmental nature, and we might take a few steps up the ladder, and then we might have an encounter where we realize, if we're critically reflecting, hey, I didn't do so well that time, and so you end up taking a few steps back. But you learn from each interaction, and I think that really helps you as to start to apply some of those skills, attitudes, and knowledge to improve and to have better interactions and experiences the next time, right? But it is a lifelong process. It's not something that we're going to say, hey, I'm competent now, I can move on to something else, right? So, and also I think it's about the fact that you're always going to interact with new people and different experiences and new cultural realities, whether they're within your own country, whether you're interacting virtually, or whether you're going to be traveling to a different environment, right? That's going to happen throughout your lifetime. I do want to bring up this model of global citizenship so we can look at, okay, what does this all mean? because when we talk about intercultural competency, it can also lead us to think about what is our level of engagement and social responsibility. And this is a model by Moraes and Ogden. And I'm currently doing a research project with 4 other colleagues in Mexico, El Salvador, and Colombia. We organized a series of encounters for students, 5 encounters, and they were looking at social justice issues. They met virtually, and they talked about topics such as climate change, immigration, racism, violence in their community, etc. And so we administered a survey based on the Moraes and Ogden assessment and their cultural framework. But then we also conducted some focus groups. And so I'm really in the beginning stages. We are in the beginning stages of analyzing the transcripts from the focus groups. However, I would like to share with you sort of these next steps. Many of the students were excited about realizing that these encounters, and they were half in Spanish and then half in English, because we were coming from environments where students were learning Spanish, students were learning English. So they learned to support one another. They also were excited to meet someone who maybe shared some of their interests. There was some deconstruction of stereotypes of what is life like in each cultural context. But then they also challenged each other regarding advocacy and media literacy in particular. So I wanted to share a couple of quotes of what are students saying, these encounters with others cross-culturally to discuss global issues. And I've given you the original Spanish of some of our focus groups conducted with Latin American students in Spanish. The first one talking about the fact that every major should talk about these issues and have these encounters, right? Cross-cultural encounters. I believe they are part of our responsibility to be informed, and I can research how I can help find solutions and how to generate empathy that sometimes I think is missing. So empathy really comes out strongly in this research project. Another student reflects by saying, we're not 100% informed. I can help to disseminate the new information I've learned. They really highlighted the idea that speaking to a real live person that lives and faces some of the social justice issues that were discussed is more important than perhaps some of the misinformation they have found online. So we can learn together to look for permanent solutions. And another quote that really represents some of the just basis for the encounters, students getting excited because they realize, well, we're different, but we're the same. So with that, I'd like to just share some of the work cited, encourage you to continue to develop your intercultural competency, to seek out these opportunities that you may have to interact with others. And now I would like to also entertain any questions that you might have. Thank you for the invitation. It's been my pleasure, and I'll be happy to connect or share more in the future. So thank you again very much.